as nuclear non-proliferation talks at the United Nations focus on the Middle East this week. We turn to new revelations about Israel's nuclear weapons program and its close alliance with Apartheid South Africa. Israeli President Shimon Peres has denied reports that he offered to sell nuclear weapons to Apartheid South Africa when he was defense minister in the 70s. On Sunday, the Guardian newspaper of London published top-secret South African documents revealing that a secret meeting between then Defense Minister Shimon Peres and his South African counterpart, PW Botha, ended with an offer by Peres for the sale of warheads, quote, in 3 sizes. The documents provide the first official written evidence that Israel has nuclear weapons, despite its policy of ambiguity and neither confirming nor denying their existence. But the Israeli president's office has categorically rejected the accusations in the report and released a statement saying, quote, Israel has never negotiated the exchange of nuclear weapons with South Africa. There exists no Israeli document or Israeli signature on a document that such negotiations took place. Well, the documents published in The Guardian were first uncovered by senior editor at Foreign Affairs Sasha Polakow-Suransky. He went through 7,000 pages of never-before-seen classified South African documents while researching his new book, The Unspoken Alliance, Israel's Secret Relationship with Apartheid South Africa. For more on the story, we're joined by Sasha himself. Sasha Polakow-Suransky joins us here. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Hi, thanks for having me.
Talk about these documents.
Well, there are 4 key documents involved in the Guardian story, and let me explain just a little bit about what each says. The first is minutes from a meeting between high-level defense officials from Israel and South Africa on March 31st, 1975, during which they discussed several things, including the possible transfer of Jericho missiles, and they use vague language to discuss warheads in 3 different sizes. Now, the Israeli government is denying that its signature or any Israeli signature is on that first document. This is actually true. It's minutes from a meeting between high-level officials. However, the second document, the same day, from the Chief of Staff of the South African Defense Force, he sends a memo to his superiors talking about how wonderful Jericho missiles armed with nuclear warheads would be for South Africa's defense strategy. And if you look through the archives, as I did, it's the first time that you actually see this issue discussed, and it happens to occur on the same day. Then, 4 days later, Shimon Peres and PW Botha sign a secrecy agreement governing all transactions in the military sphere between the 2 countries. Shimon Peres' signature is on that document dated April 3rd, 1975. And finally, if you follow this story on through the late 70s and the early 80s, you see that South Africa was only ever interested in Jericho missiles if they had a nuclear warhead on them. Various documents later on, as the 2 countries continued to cooperate in the sphere of medium-range missiles, show that South Africa only thought it was economical and useful for their defense force if these missiles were armed with nuclear warheads. So you put this all together the way that any journalist or any historian would, and it's very difficult to come to any other conclusion. It is an interpretation, but based on these 4 documents, you connect the dots, and it's quite clear that the South Africans perceived that there was a nuclear offer on the table. As I say in the book, and as The Guardian says, this deal never went through. However, the offer was perceived to be on the table, and the South Africans took it seriously enough to write a memo to the top officials in the military arguing how nuclear-armed Jerichos could help them.
And why didn't the deal go through?
Well, there are various reasons, Amy. The South Africans thought that it was prohibitively expensive, and you have to remember they were also developing their own nuclear weapons program at this time. They were just getting off the ground. The Israelis already had them, and the South Africans thought, perhaps we can do this on our own without spending this sort of money on it. And what's interesting about the Guardian revelations is this is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's not necessarily what I would have chosen as the most stunning revelation in this book, because what happened afterwards is there were deals that did go through. This one didn't go through, but throughout the late 70s and the mid-1980s, these 2 countries were cooperating in South Africa on building missile technology that the South Africans intended to use for a second generation of their nuclear weapons. I have documents from 1984 from the South African Defense Force talking about how they have to go to Israel and meet all of the Israelis who are about to move down to South Africa and work on the missile testing range, because the Israelis had greater expertise in the field of rocketry. And these Israelis all needed cover stories. And so the document from 1984 instructs South African officials to go and interview all of them and make sure that their cover stories are intact, so when a bunch of Israelis show up in a small seaside town in the middle of nowhere in South Africa, they have an excuse for being there.
What about the secret meeting in Switzerland in 1975?
So on June 4th, 1975, a couple of months after the first documents that we discussed a minute ago, Peres and PW Botha meet in Switzerland, and they continue to discuss the same deal, and again, use vague language such as the proper payload, warheads in 3 different sizes. This was always coded in these meetings. This is how people talk about such matters. It's when you connect the dots to other documents, in the case of the first one written on the same day, that you see the pattern and you see that the South Africans certainly thought that there was an offer on the table. The question of whether Peres had authorization from Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin is an interesting one. Peres has a long history as a foreign policy freelancer. He built Israel's relationship with France in the 1950s, which was crucial for Israel's own nuclear weapons program. And Peres did a lot of this behind the scenes as a mid-level official in the defense ministry, and he did not have the authorization of the foreign ministry or his superiors. And so this may be another instance of Peres acting on his own. But the key point is that the South Africans took it seriously. They perceived the offer as on the table, and that is what Peres has not responded to yet.
South Africa providing Israel with yellow cake uranium?
Okay, well, another revelation in the book that the Guardian didn't pick up on. Let me explain this one. It's a little bit more complicated, but basically, South Africa began to supply Israel with yellow cake uranium in 1961. South Africa has a great deal of natural resources, including uranium, and Israel needed it. It started in small amounts, and the shipments went to Israel. They were protected under bilateral safeguards, so not IAEA-style safeguards like we see today. This was an agreement between the two countries that the uranium would only be used for peaceful purposes. Between 1961 and 1976, this stockpile built up in Israel to about 500 tons.